Welcome, my friends. I must admit we pondered whether to hold class tonight, but the people that I talked to resoundingly affirmed that no one would be more appalled if we did not hold class than Dr. Waters. His entire life has been one dedicated to what he calls the apostolate of scholarship, and the last thing on earth that he would want is that this school which he founded should flounder at this time of this sad occasion. So here we are. I know that he was profoundly pleased the last several weeks that some of you are able to drop over and see him after class, and God willing, most of you were able to do it just this last Friday. I spoke to him after you had seen him the next day or two, and he was delighted that you had come. And indeed, he said that you had said some most kind things about my teaching, and I only mention that because from his perspective, it delighted him to know that what he had initiated in some way is continuing, and certainly he devoted the last several years of his life to this project. I know he would be delighted to know there are 17 of you here tonight. I don't know how many of you know the degree to which Dr. Waters spent his life serving the apostolate of scholarship, serving the effort to bring God's reasonable truth to the world. Offhand, I don't know all the dates myself, but I do know that towards the end of World War II, he was a pharmacy student, and I know that subsequent to that, he became a pharmacist and in fact had his own pharmacy in Sydney, Australia for a number of years. He became interested in the work of Father Woodbury with the Aquinas Academy, and eventually not only took all the courses that were offered by Father Woodbury, but took them twice and wound up as the co-teacher backup for Father Woodbury for a number of years. During that time, as some of you know, I'm not sure the exact time, he got married to his wife Elaine, and somewhere in there he finished his work with the Aquinas Academy, stopped being a pharmacist, and came to North America, to the University of Montreal, in order to earn his doctorate in philosophy so that he could teach philosophy through the world. And Father Woodbury had encouraged his students to do this. So he pursued his studies. He continued with what he could do, went to the University of Ottawa and taught for a few years, and then in 1976 came to Niagara University, where he was my much esteemed colleague for, well, until 2003 when I retired. He retired 6 months later, 2004. He, as you doubtless know, he has published numerous articles, many of them in the Social Justice Review. He has lectured in Canada, the United States, Australia, for all I know, elsewhere. He was an internationally recognized scholar, a member of the Pontifical Academy for I'm not sure the title of it exactly, but it corresponds to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences of the Vatican, the corresponding society in the United States of which he was a lifetime member. You knew him, of course, giving these courses to you, and I don't therefore have to tell you what a great teacher he was, but I can tell you, having worked for many years in the office right across the hallway from him, that I saw him endless hours talking to students on the side, when he surely didn't have to, when nobody else would. Nobody was more dedicated to working for his students then, and nobody would have been more dedicated among professional philosophers than to or any professional scholar to retire and then proceed to continue teaching to students on a gratis basis for as long as God gave him the breath to do so. And he even revising the description of the school, the Aquinas School of Philosophy, even up to the last weeks before his death. So little could you know, of course, when you saw him last Friday night, that he would enter the presence of God before this class could meet again. But I understand that arrangements are now being made for the funeral, I believe at St. Joseph's Church in the Falls, sometime early next week.
Probably Wednesday.
Probably Wednesday. There is nothing more that we can do tonight except to try to continue what we're doing here, and therefore let's proceed with the philosophy. As you know, I can't stay indefinitely. I confess that I have not reflected too extensively on the topic that you have before you. I think you've got the papers that were distributed. What I'm trying to do briefly, if that can be done, because it's pretty complex material, is to show the degree to which certain philosophical doctrines correlate. You can't just be, say, a materialist in your philosophy and a dualist in your metaphysics. That's kind of obvious. But you also cannot be a natural law ethician if your metaphysics doesn't sustain it. One of the things that I learned over the years, most central to anything that we know, is that metaphysics is the ultimate rational science. And that means that your ethics is based upon your metaphysics. If you do not know metaphysics, you cannot do ethics. When I was in graduate school, all the students were rushing around trying to find something that was easy and topical to specialize in. And everybody wanted to go into ethics. But very few people wanted to do the metaphysics. And therefore you wind up with something that's more akin to the Oprah Winfrey show when you're done than doing the real science of natural law ethics. So I have on this sheet a correlation between the different philosophical sciences and philosophical doctrines. If you have the metaphysics, I'm hoping this is lined up right. I'm not sure I drew this up correctly. Oh, this is an opposition. You can have the metaphysics of dualism as opposed to materialism. Now, there are other metaphysics, but these are the main ones that are dueling, you might say, today. You have the epistemology of realism as opposed to the epistemology of idealism, the ethics of natural law as opposed to the ethics of situationism or circumstantial ethics, goes under different names. The reason it's set up as it is to show that metaphysical dualism, epistemological realism, and natural law ethics all belong to the same side of the page. They go together. You can't fit them properly with the items that are on the right side of the page, namely materialism, idealism, and situationism. Nor can you mix these readily without getting into all kinds of problems. If you are a materialist, you have set yourself up for a certain kind of idealism, as I hope to have time to explain. And situation ethics arises because people are ignorant of or deny the epistemological foundations for natural law, which rest in the existence of universal laws. Universal laws come from the existence of universals. So you have to have some way of knowing that something can be universal before you can have universal law. I dealt with a number of situationists when I was teaching at the University of Dayton some 43 years ago, maybe a bit longer. And what they were emphasizing was that natural law didn't take into account the context, the situation in which things arise, because you may have some general principle, but it doesn't properly reflect the concrete circumstances in which a person finds himself. And that in order to understand what is really morally good or bad in a situation, you can't use some kind of an abstract, ideal, universal principle that doesn't concretely apply to the circumstance we find ourselves in. And of course, at that time, this kind of reasoning was being used not only to support contraception, but also even abortion. And of course, this is why you see so many arguments that are put forth in terms of the unique difficulties that people are in when they are finding difficulties in life, which seem to necessitate that these blind, irrational, universal, heartless rules are being applied. So the question, of course, is whether indeed these rules are heartless and whether they are blind. But one can't evaluate that without looking at the metaphysics and the epistemology that undergird the ethical context. If you look towards the bottom of the page, you'll see that there are, I'm kind of wandering around here, but I want to pick up a few other notions here. There are some positions epistemologically that we may categorize as anti-realist. Realism here being understood as our ability to know the real world around us. Let me come back to that in a minute. First of all, just momentarily, let's talk about nominalism. Nominalism is taken from the Latin nomen, meaning a name. And what it means is to affirm that direct experience tells us only about particulars and tells us nothing at all about universal representatives. In other words, all our knowledge is about particulars, so that when we use words, we are naming particular things. That's the only thing we can be doing. In the history of philosophy, William of Ockham, Bishop George Berkeley, and a number of the logical positivists belong to the nominalist tradition. It is also found in Darwinian evolution, because according to the Darwinians, you see the irony of Darwinism is you're going to talk about the origin of species, but the difficulty is there turn out not to be any real species, because a species is based on the notion of the eidos, the idea, which is a universal. So that if you're going to have new species, you go from one universal kind of thing to another universal kind of thing. The difficulty in Darwinism is that nothing does that. There aren't really any species. What we talk about as a species is just a name that we give to an arbitrary midpoint in a range of individuals that are endlessly gradating. And one population endlessly gradates into another population, so that you really can't say that there is a species of cat or horse or monkey or, for that matter, man. So nominalism befits the methodology of Darwinian evolution quite properly. The irony is that in order to have a true origin of species, we need a non-nominalist way of describing things, because we need to be able to say that something really has changed from one kind into another. So Darwin has at the very heart of his enterprise an inherent contradiction. He wants you to go from one species to another, but he doesn't really believe in species. He'll talk about them, but if you nail him down, he's not talking about species. He's talking about endlessly gradating individuals. The opposing doctrine to nominalism is called moderate realism, and that says the universals are formed by the intellect based on extramental foundations. And now this is the key, both in terms of ethics and your metaphysics and your epistemology. Is there any basis for using a universal term? What the nominalists would say is if you're defining something like a cat, or let's say man, you would do so by describing it as that set of individuals which have the following properties. So you could say, in the case of man, argumentative, humorous, having two legs, featherless, biped, that's the two legs, and so on. You describe all these individual characteristics, and somehow that tells you the group of individuals to which the name man is applied. The difficulty is that when you do that, every qualification that you use has the same problem. When you say, having a sense of humor, well, what's a sense of humor? You're going to have to define that one. And then you're going to have a set of characteristics defining that. The difficulty with nominalism is you can't define any given term. Because if you define the term, you do it in terms of describing other qualifications, then you have to define each qualification, and that in turn must be defined by other qualifications, which also must be defined. It is an endless regress. That's the difficulty with nominalism. The answer to nominalism is that the human intellect, in fact, knows natures. We are not limited to the phenomena only. I guess I'm hopping down to some of the bottom things here, but let me just draw the conclusion here, and then we'll look at the other items. It comes simply to this. Two green things are unique in the sense that no two green things are the same. In fact, no two things are the same. If two things were absolutely the same, they'd be the same thing. They'd be the same being. So everything is unique. Everything is unique. And that is probably the strongest foundation for situation ethics. Every ethical situation is unique. So how can you make a universal pronouncement about them all? Well, the answer is that you have to complete the equation. All things are unique. No two things are exactly the same shade of green, for example. But two green things are each still truly green, although in their own unique way of being green. They are either green or they are not green. And while we recognize that greenness is expressed uniquely and diversely in every green object, still all green things have something in common. The human mind can penetrate beyond the phenomena to the noumena, to the things in themselves, to the natures of things, and recognize that there are certain common qualities. So that what we say is that the universal is universal in the mind, but it has a fundamentum in re. There's a foundation in the thing. There's something outside the mind in the thing itself, which is the foundation for the universal judgment. Thus, I may indeed say that although every instance of abortion is unique and distinct in the circumstances and the reasons and the purposes and the apparent needs are all unique and distinct and different, nonetheless, what every act of abortion has in common is the direct, intentional taking of an innocent, unborn human life. That's commonality that the mind can penetrate to, which is the foundation for saying such an act is intrinsically wrong, never can be made right, and therefore the circumstances don't fix it. Just talking about the circumstances is like changing, like putting a beautiful frosting on a cake to justify eating a wormy cake. The cake is still wormy inside, no matter how perfect the frosting is and how the frosting seems to tempt us. The frosting would be the unique circumstances and differences from case to case, but those are accidental to the essence of what is taking place, namely a form of homicide. How then, though, do these other metaphysical and epistemological positions get us to that point? And let's just take a look at the next couple points here. I have a definition for sensism or empiricism, which is to accept as immediate and sole content of perception discrete particular sensuous impressions, sensations or bare sense qualities, leaving one entrapped in pure phenomena with no knowledge of the causal foundations or substances or essential natures. In other words, for the sensist, all you have is phenomena. That's all you experience is the raw sensory data. You can't get beyond it. You can't even go from the particularization of that data to any kind of universal, and you can't get beyond that data to things themselves. Representatives of that school of thought include Roger Bacon, John Locke, Bishop Berkeley, David Hume, and J.S. Mill. The opposing doctrine is one which says, yes, we have sense knowledge, but sense knowledge is combined with intellective knowledge, so that when we experience, we do not merely experience sensory data, but we also experience the intelligible content of that data, which is understood by a distinct faculty called the intellect, and that is just as much given as the data itself. For example, you may be experiencing the data of things in motion. You may be experiencing moving sensory data, but you are also understanding in some primitive way the nature of motion. That's simultaneously occurring, so that you can form a concept of motion. Combined with that, the next definition down is that of idealism. Idealism is to regard the subjective idea or image as the immediate object of knowledge. I see this is closely associated with sensism. We regard the subjective idea or image as the immediate object of knowledge with no knowledge of extramental being whatever. And of course, for that you have representatives Berkeley, Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. On both counts, the gentleman whose name comes to the fore in terms of contemporary discourse is David Hume, because the contemporary materialists trace their origins back to Hume very heavily. And Hume, of course, is a complete phenomenalist. All that we know is the sensory phenomena. How does one get to that position? There's no way we're going to go through the whole history of modern philosophy tonight, please understand. But at the same time, as I said, the materialists trace themselves back to Hume, and well they would, because materialism inevitably leads one in the direction of idealism. If you look at the last paragraph of the notes I gave you, I refer to what's called the causal theory of perception, which is the basis for idealism and of course also sets you up for sensism. It is based on a materialistic theory of knowledge, which was analyzed brilliantly by the Slovak philosopher Nicholas Olasky, who was a professor who taught a colleague of mine at the University of Dayton, Dr. Joseph Dieska. The materialist analysis of knowledge begins with external objects as causes which lead to internal experience as effects, and this in turn leads to an idealist epistemology. In simple terms, if there are any here. If we look at an object across the room, for example, those cabinets over there, we are here, or you're there, and the cabinets are over there. How do we perceive the cabinets? Well, if the lights were off, I guess we wouldn't perceive them at all, would we? So the general explanation is we perceive them because light is emanated from the fixtures on the ceiling. It bounces off the surface of the cabinets, travels through the air, and enters our eyes. Now, that's not the end of the process. What happens to that light after it comes to our eyes? You all know the rest of that one, too. It goes through the eye, through the lens, and strikes the retina, where everybody knows it gets turned upside down. And then it travels along the optic nerve and eventually winds up back in the occipital part of the brain, the back of the brain, where the image occurs. Now, the question I put to you is, what then do we know? Do we know the shelves over there, bookcases or whatever they are, what did I call cabinets, on the other side of the room? Do we know them? Or do we know this image in our brain? This image, which is conceived of as some kind of a neurological pattern. I know I've mentioned to you in the past that I saw an article in Psychology Today where they did precisely this with a rat. They took this poor rat and they aimed it at a cross on the wall and proceeded to slice off the top of its skull after putting a radioactive dye into it, and took an x-ray of the top of the brain, and they could see a cross on the top of the brain of the rat. And the authors couldn't resist saying, therefore, it's evident what we are seeing is that cross in what the rat's seeing is the cross inside its brain. And what you and I, therefore, would be seeing is those cabinets, not the cabinets themselves, but some kind of an electroneural representation of them, an image in the back of our brain. By the time you're done saying that, you have just kissed the world goodbye. Because from now on, all you're going to know is the inside of your brain. This is the foundation point for the various forms of idealism that you find in modern philosophy, according to Lasky. And I think he makes a fairly good case for it. It is a natural temptation to say that what we are experiencing is just something going on inside our brain. I mean, after all, these are the same people who say you think with your brain. And of course, that isn't the case either. The difficulty with saying that, and of course, once you've said it, you're forever trapped. I mean, you're going to wind up like Fichte in some kind of a solipsism by the time you're done. The difficulty with saying that is you've got to step back and ask yourself, how did I get into this epistemological pickle in the first place? Notice where I started with the problem. I started by saying, look, you got those cabinets over there, and here we are here, and so forth. How do you know you got cabinets over there? Realize you're starting with an assumption of extramental objects. That's what we call epistemological realism. Epistemological realism says that we don't just know ourselves, but we know external objects. And in order to get into this difficulty, you have to begin by assuming that the knowledge process is a material process. Now, being material is impossible, or isn't, pardon me, being a material is important here because being material means that the knowing subject is physically distant from the known object. If you're thinking of knowledge as something extended in space, you invariably make the subject term physically distinct from the object term. And the only way the object then can impress the subject is by some kind of a causal process, beginning in the object, going through some materially extended medium, and terminating by a change in the subject. And of course, once you do that, then it seems the only thing you know is the change in the subject. which is yourself, and you're stuck inside yourself. As I said, though, notice the only way you get there in the first place, two things, is by, number one, assuming it's a material process, and number two, assuming that we know the external world to begin with, because now we're raising the question of how do we come to know it. There's quite a pack of worms in here, and more than we're going to have time to go into tonight. But suffice it to say that if you have assumed that the process is material, that is simply an assumption. Our actual experience does not conform to idealism. Descartes, as I have in the second paragraph from the bottom, Descartes begins with a subjective reflection, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He's beginning with the immediate certitude of himself as a knowing subject and in an act of thinking. The difficulty is that that is not the only point of departure he could have made. If you are actually describing our experience is not simply self-reflective. Our experience, as Maritain puts it, is more in the form of scio aliquid esse. I know something to be. If I am in the process of fighting for my life with a wildcat, I am not likely to be an epistemological idealist. I will be quite convinced that I am dealing with some very real extramental object. Because if you consider the experience you are having at this moment, and don't overlay it with some kind of a metaphysical presupposition of materialism or idealism, your experience is of being in a room with other objects. Your experience is of those other objects. As a matter of fact, it is true, you could say at the same time, well, I know myself. Yes, you do. There's a self-reflective act going on, but it is parallel to the experience of the objects, of the other. Both are equally given. What confuses people is that when I'm fighting tooth and nail with this wildcat trying to claw me to death, I'm going to be very objective about that external reality. But you see, right now we're not doing that, are we? Right now we are imagining fighting tooth and nail with a wildcat. And since you're imagining it, because it is simply an object of your imagination, you don't have to affirm it as being extramental. As a matter of fact, it's not extramental, it's intramental. It's in your imagination, isn't it? What Descartes missed is that there is a dual immediate foundation for experience. And it is primarily an experience of extramentally other things. That's what's given an experience. It is only by a secondary reflective act that we are aware of our self doing the experiencing and of the act by which we are experiencing. So there are three elements here. There's the thing known, there's the self doing the knowing, and there's the awareness of the act of knowing. But the mere subjective awareness of the act of knowing and the self doing the knowing are not the be-all and end-all of the experience. If anything, the primary experience is of the object known. And when you are having sense experience in this world, your primary experience in this room is of the other people and the things, the tables, the cabinets, and so forth in the room. That's what you primarily know. And an adequate description of knowledge has to acknowledge that that is the starting point. If you say, but what about this explanation, for example, of the rats with the x-rays? Well, I remember looking at this book on this page in Psychology Today, and they had two photographs, one of the top of the rat's skull or brain with a cross on it, and the other with a picture of the cross on the wall. This was supposed to prove something. But you see, the difficulty is, if I took seriously what they were telling me, these images on the page are not the rat and the cross. they're just pictures. Number two, they're not even pictures because I'm not seeing the pictures according to their epistemology. I'm just comparing two images inside my own brain, which of course would prove nothing. Contemporary materialism is the stepchild of this phenomenalistic epistemology of Hume. But if you talk to any contemporary scientist or scientific materialist, and you tell them, well, all that you're telling me about the world really doesn't exist in the world, it's just in your own brain, they're going to say, oh, no, science is real, it describes the real world. So they're kind of caught in a terrible ambivalence, because they on the one hand, they're being trapped within their own epistemology, which is subjective and idealistic, but on the other hand, their science, they firmly believe, refers to the real world. As a matter of fact, how do you know you got a brain? I mean, in some cases this might be questionable anyway, but I would submit the only reason we even have a proper concept of a brain is because somebody's done clinical dissections, right? And drawn pictures of what they saw, or took photographs of it. We look at the photographs as extramental objects, because I don't think any of us have ever seen our own brain. That's why we assume we have some. And as you know, there have been cases of, hydrocephalus, in which people turn out not to have brains. Encephalus, without, yeah. They are operating with only the very thin tissue in the inside of the cranium, and some of them are getting college degrees. I've long suspected this of some of my colleagues, but at any rate.
Can they talk?
Well, anybody can talk. The problem is to talk sense. But this is why materialism gives rise to idealism. And materialism also fits in with situationism and idealism, because for the idealist, you can't talk about the real world outside you. You can't talk about things themselves. You can't talk about the objective natures of things. And that's why in ethics, you are set up for utilitarianism and situationism and circumstantial ethics, because there is no way of describing the objective intrinsic nature of anything. Not the natures of individuals, not the natures of species, not the natures of species of moral acts. You are forever dealing with individual data. So that when we look at metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, there is a correlation that exists, so that you can't just say, I'm going to be a dualist of my metaphysics, but I'm a situationist. Or you can't say that I hold natural law, but I'm a materialist. These things don't fit together. There is a consistency. You need, to come back to the epistemology, the presumption that gets you into the causal theory of perception is the materialistic doctrine, materialism. If the process of knowledge is material, then invariably I'm going to be led to thinking I just know images in my brain. But nothing says that the process of knowledge has to be material. That's simply a gross assumption. As a matter of fact, you can use the opposite line of reasoning and say, look, I start out by assuming that knowledge is material. Following that, I am driven to conclude that I don't know external objects. But the difficulty with that is, how can I be a materialist if I don't know external objects? Where'd I get the notion of the material? So I know I've done something wrong. If materialism leads to idealism, and that leads to the contradiction that I began by knowing something outside of me, but I wind up by denying that I can know anything outside of me. If I'm led to that contradiction, then I know something's wrong. If I know something's wrong, then I know the idealism must be wrong. And if I know materialism led to idealism, I know that the materialism must be wrong. Therefore, the inference I have to draw is that knowledge is not a material act, not a material entity. Knowledge, the act of knowledge, must not be extended in space. Surprise, surprise. We are dealing with a non-material act, which of course one would know from philosophical psychology, from Plato, from Aristotle, and so forth. It's a non-material act. If it is a non-material act, then we have to begin our epistemological investigation by describing the only thing that we do immediately know, and that is that we are experiencing extramental, physically given, real things. That's a given. How we do it, that's the work of the epistemologist. We have much further to go. We experience the extramentally given object. Yes, we are aware that there's a self doing the experimenting. We are aware that we can reflect on ourselves, but we don't need to do what Descartes did. We don't need to start out by doubting absolutely everything. You can't doubt everything. Descartes didn't doubt his methodic doubt. Some things have to be known. You don't just think everything. When you raise any kind of an objection or when you say anything, you always say it apodictically. You can't help it. And every great philosopher who starts his philosophical enterprise makes all kinds of assertions that are not doubted. Otherwise, he couldn't say anything. He couldn't even begin to speak. Read, for me, any philosophy book, for that matter, almost any book, where the author isn't making absolute declarations right along through everything he says. Read for me with one who doesn't support what he says with reasons. David Hume tells us that causality, has no real basis. But he writes books where he keeps using that horrible word, because. The principle of sufficient reason is supposedly just, an internal arbitrary assumption. But I've never seen a philosopher say, I haven't got any reason for what I'm saying. If he did, he wouldn't bother putting it on paper. So everybody writes from a position of assertion of certain things that he knows to begin with. And Descartes, in describing the position of the knower, makes all kinds of assertions. I mean, when he's talking about that wax that's melting and so forth, he's telling us all about the wax and the fireplace and everything else. He shouldn't say anything. If you're really going to be a total skeptic, you should be like Cratylus, just sit in the corner and lift your finger. But nobody does that. So a reasonable, rational starting point has to start with what we universally experience. And what we universally do experience is being in a world of other things that are given to us as extended in space. If we deny that, we're denying what is immediately given. How we do it, that's another interesting question. And that would be proper to epistemology as such. But remember that it's the relationship between your metaphysics, your epistemology, and your ethics is universal. So if somebody's going to be off the track on one, he's going to be off the track on the others. And if he's on track on one, he's probably going to be on track on the others. Okay, does anybody have any questions before we?
I had read a book that knocked me off the rails back in college, and it was about the varying ways that animals perceive compared to the way humans perceive. In other words, a frog can see the same thing that I see, yet in his brain it registers differently because his brain is wired differently. So if what he sees, or what a cat sees, or whatever, is different, like they wouldn't see color, some of them wouldn't see color, then we have to apply that to ourselves too, that it's because of the wiring of our brains that we're able to say this is real. But to the frog, it's a totally different reality.
It's not a question of what is real. It's a question of we have faculties, or we have organic instruments that enable us to perceive, for example, color, which perhaps the frog doesn't perceive. But the absence of an experience doesn't mean that there's nothing there. In other words, if somebody's colorblind, it doesn't mean that what they see isn't there, but they just aren't picking up the color. They don't have the sensory capability of doing it. So, and also I would kind of ask, when we talk about what these animals do in their perception and what they're doing when they're thinking, whether we aren't falling into the fallacy of anthropomorphism. I'd like to know exactly how we know what they're experiencing. Did somebody become a frog to do it?
It was Prince.
But that's what you always have to do. And this is one of the difficulties with many of your researchers. Most of your scientific researchers are, by their very nature, scientific materialists. They can't help it. You know, they got out of their diapers that way. And that's the way they look at everything. It's just like the animal studies researchers. They're invariably Darwinians. They are invariably positivists in their way of looking at the animal. And therefore, they just assume if the animal acts a certain way, and I act that way, and I'm thinking this, therefore the animal's got to be thinking this. If man is a highly developed animal, then animals are just underdeveloped men. And therefore, whatever we experience, they must be experiencing analogously. There's no epistemological basis for making that kind of statement. And of course, if you know Aristotelian philosophy, you know that they have senses, but we have senses plus intellect. And what they are lacking is the ability to understand the world around them. The intelligibility of the world is what's missing. We go through a world not merely sensing it, but always trying to understand it, even when we're little babies. We're always trying to understand the meaning of it. To abstract meaning, to abstract universal content. Because that's what the intellect does, and that's what enables us to categorize ethical activity to be of a certain kind, a certain nature, as being essentially evil or in itself good, but possibly qualified by other circumstances. It could make it bad. That we have to bear in mind too.
Well, they use that as an argument for skepticism and relativism. That if you know, we can't know the noumena if various species don't see a totally different picture of the same reality, that we can't say that there is really one reality. There's only what we perceive as reality.
Well, animals aren't getting the noumena anyway. All they are dealing with is the phenomena, because all they're doing is have sense experience. Our experience is never merely sensual. It is sense intellect experience all the time. You can't, as I mentioned in the previous class, you can't even imagine what it is not to have an intellectual reflection on your sensory experience. By the time you're aware you're having the experience, it's intellectual.
And would that be evident by the fact that man changes and develops and progresses, whereas the animal stays in the same state? He will never.
That's one of the signs that man does
like
make.
The beaver builds the dam the same damn way.
Yeah.
But man builds. But man goes from tents to other structures.
Exactly. Because we're always trying to figure out how to make a better mousetrap.
So that would tell something about our perceptions too.
Yeah, and also that we're never satisfied.
Well, there you go.
Damn good observation.
Okay, anything else? I think we will draw to evening because I've run out of material. I'm sorry that you can't do what you did last Friday night.
This set of philosophy lectures is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, 2316 Delaware Avenue, PMB 325, Buffalo, New York, 14216, please visit our webpage at www.aquinasphilosophy.com.